facing across from the buildings, miniature buildings about 9 feet away, was a row of air cannons and several Ritters and E-fans. These were spread out along the length of the entire miniature, delivering the force to the buildings. It was a pretty lethal looking combination. It got to be pretty frightening looking at all these air cannons lined up with their cones, and some of these cones were filled with debris and metal shrapnel. We actually packed them with metal shrapnel as well to help disintegrate the building facades. We used 9 air cannons in total, 5 of which we had custom built for the film. These each were delivering like 200 pounds of pressure. We had also had 2 Ritters with louvers set up to augment those in between the air cannons, and several E-fans. The thing that was very interesting to see is that once this blast would go off, after we did our first take, we'd see if there were any gaps in that coverage of wall of air coming across the shot, a building or a piece wouldn't go. And the one thing we couldn't have in the shot was 2 buildings blow away and the middle one kind of gets a little shot. We needed an even wall of pressure to take everything out. That became, again, a huge problem of delivering a continuous solid wall of air into these models and then continuing that movement right on through the set and away and out of the frame. So we did quite a number of takes to achieve that. We found that very often we had 2 cannons aimed at a particular structure, and we'd find sometimes their own air currents would neutralize each other or bend the air around each other and leave a little section in the middle intact. So we had to do some experimenting to find out the best configuration of these cannons, and very often it was a matter of a ½ inch or an inch. Either way would make a big difference by the time that air got to the building. Even with all of that force, we found that these buildings would shatter and fall so far and then drop. The particles would drop. They wouldn't carry fully out of frame. So we found ourselves augmenting all of these air cannons, the Ritters, the E-fans, and airlines also, with upwards of 25 or 30 cables attached to the back of the set. These were wired into the structures that were holding up the breakaways. Those wires carried over to trapdoor drops that were weighted down with sandbags, and these were triggered by a computer. So what we had was on the fire cue or the blast cue, we had the air cannons go off, the Ritter louvers opened up, the airlines were triggered on, the E-fans were turned on, and at that same moment a computer tripped the drops on the sandbags, and all these wires also pulled the model apart internally to get this full disintegration and carry everything out of the shot. So it was quite a deal. It was like a giant machine. In addition to the breakaway miniature, we layered in several exposures of particles that were blown across the frame with an air cannon. These particles consisted of little bits and pieces, fuller's earth, some glitter, broken glass, that sort of thing. We also shot a miniature car that was matted into the shot, and several other elements of flying debris. We didn't actually use any fire in any of the shots. The scale would not have allowed us to put fire in those shots, and as it turned out, it's mostly flying debris. You don't actually see any fire occurring. We introduced a sense of fire coming up the surface of the buildings by tinting the smoke elements that we shot with a very rich red high-con color element. There are 2 other shots in the sequence, the street level sequence. One is of a freeway and an exit ramp with a bus that gets blown away, and another is of a park, kind of a park area where we have trees that get blown over. Those 2 shots had to be shot in a mirror, because as it turned out, we had built the sets in full, and we're in the process of shooting these elements when the live action portion of this sequence had begun. So we went up to the location where Jim was shooting the very first shot, which is the playground. The sequence begins on the playground, and because of the direction of the sun on that particular day, he approached us and he said, well, you know, it would work better if the sun was from the direction of lighting was from the right side of the picture and not the left. Can we key the rest of the sequence in this way? And we very nicely and politely said, oh yeah, we can do that. So we found ourselves, for the two existing sets that had been set up, shooting into a front surface mirror. And that made it a little more complicated, but we got through it. I'll say one of the things that we had to do shooting in the mirror for the freeway shot was to reverse all of the graphics, the freeway sign, the stop signs, the road signs. We also had to make the passenger side of the bus into a driver's side, rearrange the steering wheels on some of the cars and that sort of thing. So there were probably about 50 little details like that that had to be modified for that shot. In the scene of the park being blown away by the nuclear blast, we had very prominently in the foreground a stop sign. And this stop sign we had to make a mirrored image of. We laid it out in reverse, so when we shot in a front surface mirror, it was in the correct orientation. The reason we elected to shoot in a mirror was due to the fact that at that stage we were not planning on doing any opticals. We were not going to do any enhancements, and we felt if we could solve the problem on the set, then we would wind up with a better result. We felt we would have a purer, crisper image. As it turned out, most of those shots underwent further optical enhancement. So the kind of optical enhancements that occurred were after the fact changes. Jim wanted some fire on the trees, a little more smoke in the shot. What we discovered in going to opticals is that we got a grittier look, tougher and a more contrasty look, which is something we had talked about earlier on. We had discussed with Jim the possibility of degrading the image in some way, making it a little more contrasty, a little grittier. One, to affect the sense of the documentary footage, and two, to give it a slightly displaced quality that you would have in a nightmare. Those two qualities, I think, helped the sequence quite a bit. So the optical degradation actually worked in our favor. So we were in the city level street shots no longer avoiding the use of opticals. We were planning on enhancing them further with opticals. What Jim was facing was creating the illusion that this was an up and running steel mill, when in fact it was nothing had happened there for years and years. There are several different approaches I suppose he could have taken. One was simply to address the art department, say, come up with something here. Here's a photograph of a real steel mill, and here's some tapes, and have a look at it, and throw a bunch of money at it and see what they would come up with in terms of creating glowing liquids, etc. The other approach is to maybe take a little bit of money and a little bit of time in advance and create that situation in miniature and manipulate it and try to solve those problems in a way that was handleable. Jim's approach on that was that he found that if you could demonstrate physically in miniature how this effect could work, you would solve all those problems in a desktop situation rather than going to a steel mill and spending a lot of time and a lot of money, lots of materials and hundreds of man hours. So Jim thought in terms of approaching a special effects company, namely ourselves, to do a microcosm of this steel mill and see what we could come up with to create the illusion of pouring molten metal. So what we did was made a small scale model. I think it was an 1/8 scale section of a generic steel mill with the kind of look you'd expect to see there, the kind of lighting levels you'd expect to see in a steel mill. We looked at some of the storyboards that already existed of what Jim was planning on doing to get a feel for what it would look like. Again, knowing that the relationship of brightness to the background was a factor and that sort of thing. So we created a ladle and a tun dish, and our initial approach was to bottom light the tun dish and fill it with a liquid that would conduct light up to the surface, which in this case was methocel. We set up the ladle above it, and we made a clear resin casting of the pour that went from the ladle into the tun dish, and had a custom neon rods set in behind that resin piece. And then what we did was to pour methocel down that resin spout with all this backlighting on it to create the illusion that this material was glowing internally. And that worked very well. What we were creating in miniature was a total mock-up of all the different techniques that would need to be employed by the art department. This mock-up was then done by the art department in full scale in a series of additional tests that we were involved with supervising or co-supervising with the art director and Adam Greenberg. And we were there involved with the placing of colored gels inside the ton dish to get the correct degree of sort of edge lighting on the glow. We'd have a hot center and kind of would taper off to yellow and orange around the edges to give this sense of thickness and mass to the metal. These large-scale tests that were done by the art department did prove satisfactory and were ultimately what were implemented at the full-size steel mill, essentially a blown-up version of what we had done in miniature.
Jim's a very technical director, and he really designs all the stuff in advance, pretty much. So the storyboards that we got 9 months ago were very similar to the ones that we actually shot 5 months later, and that we followed through and doing the our CG work in. So it's a big advantage to us to be able to have a director who's got a vision that's that focused and is that consistent throughout it. Any changes he makes are only embellishments and improvements.
I mean, the concept has to come first, not the technique. The technique follows. We had to imagine the lighting. We had to imagine every part of the scene in advance, not having shot the scene yet, which was pretty scary. But I think we did a pretty good job of integrating it, and really storyboarding was the key to that, really knowing exactly how each cut was going to work.
The storyboards that Jim had done for T2 are very much like the final ones in the film. I've never worked with anybody that's held that close to them. Maybe, we mirror imaged one left to right, and that was about it. But basically, they're pretty much the same. A few little changes here and there, but it really helped us a lot to be able to know what we were doing. At that point, there were so many outstanding questions as to what was going to work and what wasn't going to work, that it was very valuable to us for him to keep that focus.
The placement of music in the film is at least equal to what the music is, and where you have the music and where you don't put music, and whether it's big music or small music is really essential, and those choices are as much part of the creative process as the actual writing of the melody and the choosing of the orchestration. The placement, which we call spotting, going back to process, we call that spotting the film. I sit with the director and we talk through the film, and we have a spotting session, and that spotting session is to choose the spots where the music goes. And I think it's one of the most crucial parts of the process, and I change it all the time. We decide and then it changes, but still there are films where they don't put music on dialogue scenes. That's a completely comprehensive choice. We're not going to do dramatic underscore to the dialogue scenes, or we are going to do a classic, almost old-fashioned underlining of the dialogue scenes. You can see the same movie with a dialogue scene scored and without, and it'll be a different film. One would feel sort of gritty and contemporary, and the other one might feel a little more classic. Gary Summers was the gentleman who sat on a board much bigger than this, but at a given moment in the film, he's got my 6 music tracks, and it might be left, center, and right percussion, left, center, and right sustains and orchestral sounds, and he's actually working and trying to get the music to help the scene. If there's a moment of dialogue and the music's a little loud, hopefully so the audience doesn't notice it, he's pulling the music back, and then the dialogue's over and he'll push it through. And he does all this manipulation that you don't hear. The score, in my opinion, is finally, in a sense, created on the dubbing stage, because if I create a piece of music and that music is played too loud, everyone thinks the composer always wants the music loud, but if a piece of music that's meant to be supportive is played too loud, then everyone thinks, oh, the composer really botched that scene. He really stepped all over the scene. The music was played at the wrong level in many cases. Sometimes if a piece of music needs to be powerful and it's played too low, then people will feel like, boy, the composer didn't really add much energy to that scene. The difference between 6 decibels can make the difference of whether a cue works in a scene or not. The soundtrack album is sort of a great vanity moment for the composer, because it's the time where I get to present the music not in competition even with the visual. I mean, certainly not with the sound effects, because that's the toughest thing. If a score is well designed, it should meld really well with the sound effects, and I feel that was part of the success of the Terminator scores, was I really took into account the sound effects and created things that sort of bridged between music and sound effects. But still, it's an opportunity for the listening audience to really hear what you did very clearly. So therefore, what we did was, when I was done with the score and had delivered and took a little bit of a break, I put up the tracks again and I really listened and based my mixes on what I felt was the most complete experience of the music as an element by itself. So of course things shifted, because I didn't quite have to be concerned about a given moment hurting the dialogue. So there might have been moments where I held back, where in my mix I could really let something breathe through, and also the same versus having to do with sound effects, where I didn't have to be concerned about the sound effects. So also the stereo placement is different. So the mix, to be a good record mix for a CD, is a different mix than a film mix.